Hi, everybody. Welcome to the second to last week. We are at inventory management. A lot of the content that we're going to talk about in this section corresponds almost directly to supply chain management because as we work towards globalization, right, competition is between supply chains, not just companies, which means that as we work with a number of different suppliers and vendors and retail outlets, managing the inventory between that supply chain between each one of those organizations is extremely challenging. And the key, from our standpoint in trying to keep costs down is with respect to inventory, making sure that we can balance basically the amount of inventory we have on hand with customer service. Right, so we could have a ton of inventory on hand, making sure that we could always meet our customer demand, but we know that there's going to be some really big holding costs associated with that. So again, we're going to try to keep inventory as low as possible without, obviously negatively impacting our customer service. So we're going to go through a number of models in this chapter. These are available in your book as well. We're only going to cover a few of the key ones. There are a lot of additional models even within the text that we're not going to go into in as much detail. But the ones that I'll cover on this video are ones that you certainly want to make sure that you're aware of and are prepared for on the final exam. So just to get us started, as we think about inventory, how we manage inventory in our facility, for many of you that may have worked in retail or with a larger company, one of the things that we're always challenged with is making sure that we have accurate inventory records. And a part of that process is typically doing some sort of, periodic inventory checks to go through, with a team, whether it's on a weekend or whether, you offer it as overtime, going through inventory, making sure that everything is there and shoring up those counts in whatever software system you're using, and also trying to address any major issues that you find. So it usually doesn't make great sense to just do that for every SKU or stock keeping unit that you have on hand. Typically, you want to make sure that those key items that either have a big price tag or are, in high demand or might pose some other issues from a customer standpoint, those ones that you want to be absolutely sure you don't stock out of, we're going to want to check those more frequently. As we think about managing our inventory, that's what we would be considering our A inventory. So we're going to go through ABC analysis really quickly. There is a question on your homework about this, and this will correspond to as we go through and do cycle counting to make sure that our inventory records are accurate. This is one way that we can think about where we want to focus our attention. The easiest way to do this is to look at annual dollar volume. Right? So you can take all of your SKUs or stock keeping units. You can have your annual volume, multiply that by your unit cost, and that's going to give you your annual dollar volume that you have for that SKU. And we're going to just use the Pareto principles here, whereas we're going to focus on the critical few as opposed to the trivial many. And the way that we do this for ABC analysis is those SKUs that will get you to about the 80% range in terms of your overall annual dollar volume. So if you can see here, the first two SKUs, right, if you add together, or if you even just look at the individual percentages, percent of total dollar volume, right, the first two are going to add up to 72%. So we're getting kind of really close to that 80% marker. So those are the first two that we would considerize or classify as A-level inventory products. And then, you're going to take basically the next chunk is about 20 to 30%. Those are going to be your B level, and the remaining SKUs or stock keeping units are going to be your C level. So the reason this is important and the reason why we would do this sort of categorization is that as we go through and do cycle counting, best practice is not to just shut down the facility or have a number of people working overtime on one day just to go through and count all of the inventory. That is not beneficial for a number of reasons. One of them is that these things are very infrequent. These big events to track inventory are very infrequent, which means that if you've got major issues with your inventory counts, you're not going to want to wait until the end of the quarter to try to address some of them. So also it's very time intensive and usually not nearly as effective as having some sort of like continuous check. So one of the ways that we could do this or think about doing this is if we have our item classification, so A, B, and C, And in this example, if we know that, say, we've got 5,000 total items in inventory, and we've designated 500 as A items, 1,750 as B items, and 2,750 as C items, we might want a different cycle counting policy for each one of those classifications. So we could say for Class A, we want to do it every month to make sure that there's no issues with those high dollar value inventory products. Then the B value, we might say we want to do every quarter, whereas C would be every 6 months. Then we can simply identify, if we've got 500 total items in our A classification, and we know in each month there are 20 working days, then we know that we should be checking 25 Class A items in inventory each day. And if we do the same kind of breakdown for B and C classifications, that's going to give us a total of 77 items per day. Again, we've got 5,000 total items in inventory, and instead of getting an all hands on deck approach to checking those, once a quarter, whatever, frequency that the company chooses, it's usually better if you can designate a material handler, a warehouse manager, somebody who's just as a part of their everyday, using this classification system, going to go through and check these items, check about 77 items each day. That's going to help ensure that for those Class A items where there's a high dollar value or there's some kind of something bigger at stake in terms of not wanting to have a stock out, that's certainly where you want to focus your energy and attention, and this approach is going to enable you to do that. So aside from inventory accuracy, which is something that we still see a lot of organizations struggle with, even kind of some more mature organizations, we really want to get a little bit more sophisticated in how we think about ordering, how much we should have on hand. And the goal, again, is we want to strike a balance between costs, inventory levels, and because obviously the lower the inventory levels, lower our overall cost is going to be, but we want to balance that with customer service. Or I guess the negative version or view of that is stockouts. So our inventory model that we're going to talk about next is called the EOQ model, which stands for Economic Order Quantity. For those of you that are starting your MBA program or thinking about going into an MBA program, this is certainly something that's probably going to come up in at least a couple other classes. It's a really important fundamental concept to how we work throughout the supply chain. And it's going to take into account a few key items. The first and foremost is your holding costs. Those are all of the costs associated with, holding or allocating a certain portion of the rent, for your warehouse to each item. You're also going to have labor in terms of material handling and moving the pallets and the cases around and unloading them. So all of those kind of costs go into what we consider to be holding costs. Now, we also have ordering costs. Now, this might seem a little less relevant today when typically there's not a cost associated with necessarily placing an order, but we might also think about this as, shipping, the cost of receiving those goods, right? So again, while we don't want to have a ton of stock in inventory because there's going to be a lot of holding costs associated with that, we want to kind of bring that level down. But again, if it's too low, we risk having a stock out and disappointing our customers. And if that inventory cost is also too low, then we're probably going to incur a lot of ordering cost or even shipping costs, right? Every time that we have to reship. So again, the EOQ model is going to help us take all of that information into account and find the optimal quantity that we should be ordering based on some of these metrics. So the key formula that you have to be aware of is Q star. That's our EOQ model. And kind of go through, the way we solve it here is we basically take our setup costs, and we want to set that equal to our holding costs. And the point at which those two things are equal is going to help us. We're going to solve for Q in this case. That's, again, the economic order quantity. That is our optimal amount that we want to order to balance those two costs. So Q star at the very bottom equals the square root of 2 multiplied by our annual demand, which is that D, multiplied by our setup cost, all divided by our holding costs. So we'll walk through a very quick example for this. Right, so if we're thinking about the optimal number of needles to order for a hospital or for a department, we could think of one of the key assumptions here is that our demand is somewhat constant, which is not always going to be the case. So we'll touch on those probabilistic models next. But if we think that or have some sort of certainty that, yes, we have pretty stable demand, In this case, we're going to say that demand is 1,000 needles for our department in a hospital, and our setup, or we can think about it as shipping costs, might be $10 per order, right? Every time we get a shipment in, it's going to cost us essentially $10. Now, there's some holding costs associated with this as well. We're going to assume for this case that it's going to be about 50 cents per unit per year. So that's basically the cost of, having this in the needles in maybe a secured case cart somewhere on the floor. So using our EOQ model, we're going to plug in under the square root 2 multiplied by 1,000, which is our annual demand, multiplied by 10, which is our setup cost in this case, all divided by 50 cents, which is our per unit per year holding cost. And that's going to come out to 200 units. So that's our economic order quantity. If we want to figure out an inventory model system and for ordering that's going to keep costs low, but also balance our service levels. And really, in this case, the EOQ model, again, is balancing our setup, our ordering cost versus our holding costs. That economic number that we should be ordering is 200 units. So putting this into practice, if we want to get, what's our expected number of orders then per year, our N is going to be equal to our annual demand, which again is 1,000, divided by our order quantity, Q star, which we just solved for, which was 200, which is going to suggest that we place 5 orders approximately each year. And we can also think about, okay, well, 5 orders per year, then what's the expected time between orders? That's simply the number of working days per year, which we generally assume to be 250, divided by the expected number of orders, which we have just solved for, which was 5. And that tells us that about every 50 days, we should be ordering the economic order quantity of 200 needles. Now, we can also calculate the total annual cost, which we do by adding up the setup costs and the holding costs. So again, we can go and we can use those setup costs. Again, to figure out the EOQ model, we would just set those two costs equal to each other and solve for Q. Here, we're going to be adding the two of them. And one key way to know whether or not you have correctly solved your Q is that when you calculate your setup and your holding costs, they should be exactly the same, right? Because that's the point at which you're able to get that optimal value or that order quantity. So in this case, right, we can solve for our setup cost. It's going to be our annual demand, which is 1,000 divided by Q star, which is 200, all multiplied by our setup cost, which is $10 per order, plus our Q star, which is again 200 divided by 2, all multiplied by our holding cost of 50 cents per unit per year. Then we can solve, solve this, all the values, and we would get our total cost for this model would be $100 for this sort of inventory management model. Now, if you wanted to actually go through, if you're doing this for the books, as we saw in the last module on our financial statements, we actually have the amount, the percent invested in inventory. We not only want to include, how much money we're spending on our setup and our holding costs, but we also want to include the total value of all the inventory on hand, which would simply be the product price, right? The price per needle multiplied by our annual demand, which again in this case was, I think, 1,000. Is it 1,000? Yes, 1,000 units. So again, if you were really kind of going a step further for your financial statements, you'd want to include that as well. So EOQ tells us basically how much we have to order, but we also want to figure out our reorder point, which is basically that when question. And this is going to be dependent on our lead time between the time we place an order and the time we receive it, right? So if we're ordering something from Amazon and you've got Prime, you can with some degree of certainty know that you're going to get your order in 2 days, right? So we're just going to assume for this case that we know our lead time. So we want to determine our reorder point, which is simply our demand per day multiplied by our lead time for a new order in days, right? And we can determine our demand per day by taking our annual demand, which is our D, divided by the number of working days in a year. So in this case, we're going to take iPads sales, right? So if annual demand is 8,000, and we're going to divide by, again, number of working days in a year, which we always assume to be 250. That's going to tell us that our demand per day is 32 units. Now we want to multiply that by our lead time, which is about 30, either in this case, lead time for orders is 3 working days. It may take 4. So depending on, and we can actually use some more specific probabilistic models to solve for this case in a bit. If you had more information and you had some sort of probability distribution around lead time, it would basically tell you that if you know that your annual demand or per day, daily demand is going to be 32 units, and let's say best case scenario, you receive the shipment in 3 days, that means that you've got to at least make that order when you've got 96 units left on hand, right? If you know that you're going to use 32 units per day, it's going to take you 3 days to get that next shipment in. You want to be ordering, worst case scenario, at 96 units. If it's going to take you 4 days, then you want to do that at 128 units. So the cases that we just went through, we were assuming some sort of stability in demand, and also, in lead time to some extent. Even though in the last case we were looking at, okay, best case scenario, it could take 3 days, worst case scenario, it could take 4 days. Now we're going to transition into probabilistic demand models, where basically this would apply when product demand isn't known, but you could use a probability distribution to help you kind of figure out basically what the variability is or what the standard deviation is in terms of annual demand for whatever product you're selling. So in this case, we're going to use service levels to set safety stock, basically how much we need to have on hand to make sure that we're able to achieve some level of service for our customers. And we do this when the cost of stockouts is uncertain. So in this case, we're going to set our reorder point as equal to, we're going to say, what is our demand during lead time, right? That lead time is time between we place an order to the time where we receive the shipment. What does our demand during that lead time look like? And we want to add on some safety stock. And that's, again, we're going to come back and use our Z tables from our normal probability distributions. And we're going to multiply that Z value times the standard deviation of our demand during lead time. So we'll walk through an example to help you think through this. Okay, so in this case, we're going to come back to the needle example. Let's say in this case, we know that we don't have just a set demand, but we're going to say that on average, if we had historical data and we could, fit a normal probability distribution to it, our average demand during reorder time is going to be about 2,000 needles, right? From the time that we place an order to the time we receive that shipment. Our standard deviation of demand during that lead time is about 400 needles based on our data. And we want to make sure, in this case, right, you could argue that you want 100% service level. But let's say maybe, worst case scenario, you could go to another department and you could get more if needed. Not advised, but we're going to assume that for some reason they're setting their service level at 95%. So 95% of the time, if a patient needs a needle, it is going to be there. Which corresponds to a 5% stockout policy. So if our service level is going to be 95%, we want to use our Z curve again, or area under the curve, to get our Z value, which in this case, to get 95%, that's going to correspond to a Z value of 1.65. And then, now that we have that Z value and we also know the standard deviation of demand during lead time, then we can set our safety stock level, which in this case is going to be that 1.65 multiplied by the 400 needles. That, again, that standard deviation of demand during lead time. And that's going to say that our safety stock level should be 660 needles. So our reorder point is going to be that expected demand during lead time plus that safety stock. And that's going to say, again, in order to meet that 95% service level, we're going to have to reorder when we've got, just over 2,500 needles, to be more specific, 2,660, right? This is really important, especially if you're working in the medical field where you know that you need a supply on hand and you need to set that service level really high. In other cases that we're going to review in just a moment, right, there are some other cases where it may actually make more sense for you to have a lower service level so that you can keep inventory levels low and your costs low so that you can actually increase your profit. But if, again, you're working in an area where you have to have some stock in the event that somebody needs it, then certainly you'd want to use some of these models, especially if demand is going to be variable, to help you determine exactly what your reorder point should be to help you achieve that service level for your customers or your patients. So we're going to cover just a couple more probabilistic models. The next one we're going to look at is when demand is variable, but lead time is constant. So again, this could be, Amazon example, your lead time is going to be two days with some, pretty much 100% certainty, but your demand might be variable over that time. So now your reorder point is going to be your average daily demand times your lead time in days. And then you're going to add on your z-value times your standard deviation of demand during lead time. And in this case, we're going to determine our standard deviation of demand during lead time is going to be our standard deviation of demand per day multiplied by the square root of our lead time. So let's say in the market, for those of you that have been in Ridge Hall, the market is just a little kind of coffee lunch shop that has snacks and drinks. We're going to take a Clif Bar example and say, okay, in the case of the market here in Ridge Hall, we're going to say that we've got some average daily demand, and we could look at historical data. We could see that it's normally distributed, and we could see that on average we've got 15 Clif Bars. So our lead time in day, we could say we know is consistently, as soon as we place an order, we're going to receive a new shipment in within 2 days. So that's constant. In this case, we could also say that standard deviation of daily demand equals 5. We know that there's some standard deviation associated with our normal distribution of demand for Clif Bars in the market. And we might also say that, we do strive in the market to meet customer demand. We don't want to keep a lot on inventory, but we want to make sure that 90% of the time if somebody comes in for a Clif Bar, that they're going to have it. You never know those emergency situations where somebody needs a crunchy peanut butter Clif Bar before their exam to help them make sure they get through it okay and can stay focused. So in this case, our reorder point would be 15 Clif Bars, which is our average daily demand normally distributed, multiplied by our lead time in days, which is constant, so 2 days. And then we're going to add on our safety stock, which is going to help us make sure that we achieve that service level of 90%. And to do that, we're going to, again, use that z-value, which from our appendix, in this case, is 1.28, all multiplied by our standard deviation of demand during lead time, which, again, we're going to take 5, which is our standard deviation of daily demand, and multiply that by our square root of our lead time in days, which is 2. And that's going to tell us that we should reorder when we have 39 Clif Bars left. Because even though our average daily demand is 15 bars, and we know it's going to take 2 days, right, to get that shipment in. So somebody might think, oh, well, okay, well, as soon as we hit 30, then I'm going to reorder. Because typically on average, there's, 15 are sold each day, and it's going to take us 2 days to get them. But again, if we're looking to achieve a specific service level, which in this case is 90%, we're going to have to use those z-values to help us figure out exactly how much safety stock we should add on, which in this case turns out to be about 9 bars. So if our reorder point is 39 bars, then we will, over time, assuming that our probability or our demand distribution stays about the same, we're going to ensure that we constantly meet a service level of 90%. So there's one more model that I'd like to cover, which is, I think, one of the more interesting models, referred to as the newsboy model. This is when you only place one order for a product, and this could be daily, but after this time period, those units have little or no value at the end of the sales period. So we call this the newsboy model because if you could think about daily newspapers, right? Nobody wants to read yesterday's newspaper because, especially now, the news cycle is so fast that yesterday's news is just so old. So you want today's paper. You don't want yesterday's paper. So with respect to that, we're going to have 2 costs. The cost of being short from the newsboy's perspective. If he's short, if he doesn't have enough papers on hand, he's basically going to be losing out profit, right? So our cost of being short is the sales price of the unit, whatever he would sell a paper for, minus what he paid for that. That profit is going to be the cost of shortage. And then we also have a cost of overage, which is basically going to be his cost for each unit minus whatever sort of salvage value he may get. Like the New York Times may say, okay, well, we'll buy back the papers that you don't sell for 20 cents, so you're not completely out. We can reuse the material. That's going to help us. These values are understanding our cost of shortage and our cost of overage in this sort of single model inventory case is going to help us determine what our service level should actually be. So in this case, let's assume that our average demand for papers in this Newsboy model is going to be 120 papers per day. And we look at the probability distribution, we see that it's got a standard deviation of about 15 papers. Now we want to know our cost of shortage. In this case, we're going to be able to sell a paper for $1.25 each, but we actually paid 70 cents for them. Right, so that's going to tell us that we have a profit there of 55 cents, or that would be equivalent to our cost of being short. We'd just be losing out on that profit. Our cost of overage is going to be 70 cents, which is what we bought for the paper, minus any salvage value, which again was 30 cents. So that's going to mean our cost of overage is going to be 40 cents. So every time we have a paper on hand at the end of the day, for each paper, our cost of being over is going to be 40 cents to us. So using this equation, we can determine our optimal service level. So in the numerator, we have our cost of shortage, which is 55 cents, all divided by our cost of shortage plus our cost of overage, which in this case is going to tell us that our optimal service level is 58%. So just over half of the people are going to be we're going to have enough inventory to service just over half of our customers. And while that might seem really low, based on this information for, the price that we're selling the paper for, whatever the cost that we purchased the paper for, and then any salvage cost that we might get in, right? That's all going to inform our cost of being short and our cost of being over, which is going to tell us exactly what our customer service level should be. It may not feel good to only be able to service 58% of our customers, but if we start to keep more papers on hand, it's actually going to reduce our overall profits. So in this case, if we want to determine how many papers to have on hand, if we know that our service level is about 58%, that 0.579 corresponds to a z-value in our appendix of 0.2. So all we take is our average number of papers sold each day, which is 120, plus our z-value, which is 0.2, all multiplied by our standard deviation, our daily standard deviation of papers sold, which is 15. And finishing out that calculation, that's going to tell us that every day we should be planning to order 123 papers. That's again going to put us at a service level of about 58%, which might not feel great. And that's where too you have to start to try to take into account some of the factors like if you only have a service level of about 58%, are you actually going to be doing damage to your future business because people aren't sure if they're going to be able to rely on you to get what they need? So there's some of those things that you may want to consider as well as you determine your service level. But if we're just going to take it on our cost of shortage and cost of overage and try to minimize our overall cost and increase our profitability, this is what the Newsboy model would suggest that we do. If you have any questions as you finish the last homework, please don't hesitate to reach out.